It's my pleasure to introduce to you Jenny Leigh Smith, who will serve as the facilitator and respondent for this session. Jenny Smith is an assistant professor of history at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Her work focuses on food, agriculture, and the environmental impact of farming and food distribution. Her first book, Works in Progress, Plans and Realities on Soviet Farms, examined the environmental legacy of agricultural industrialization in the Soviet Union. Her new project is a global history of emergency famine relief over the course of the 20th century. Please welcome Jenny Leigh Smith.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here today, and a special thank you to Deanna for organizing this conference. I was telling her at lunch that as someone who has organized workshops and conferences or helped in that process, she's sort of putting the rest of us to shame. This has really, I feel like this has run very well, and she's just done a spectacular job. So thank you very much for making my job so easy, Deanna. So I'm here today mostly to do introductions, and then I'll offer some brief comments at the end. I just want to say I'm really excited to be here. I've really already gotten a lot out of this day. But my first job is to introduce our first speaker, which is Dr. Jacob Wright, who serves as the Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University, as well as the Director of Graduate Studies in Emory's Tam Institute for Jewish Studies. And he's also an associate faculty member at Emory's Center for the Study of Law and Religion. He has received prestigious awards from several different organizations, and I see that he has a fairly new book, David, King of Israel, and Caleb in Biblical Memory, which came out in 2014 among his other publications. So please welcome to Dr. Wright.
And thanks again to Deanna for putting together what has turned out to be a really fascinating symposium, rich discussions, as well as inspiring. In the time that it's allotted to me, I just was asked to kind of speak about food in Judaism. I'm not an expert. I don't have, in contrast to my esteemed colleagues, projects that relate around food in the present contemporary context, but rather in the ancient context and how food and eating and commensality, the eating together, the table fellowship, worked in the context of warfare and peace treaties and alliances, and what kind of importance it enjoyed in ancient societies, and the table commensality around the king, but also around average people. And within Judaism, we could say that food is probably the most central of all activities. It really takes up more space in the Talmud and in the rabbinic literature than really any other discussion. That might be pushing it a bit. Shabbat is a second one, the Sabbath. And today, these two activities of keeping the Sabbath, but also keeping a certain very regulated form of eating practices, defines what it means to be a practicing observant Jew. And so within Judaism today, communities you'll see when they go to eat, if they're religious and observant, they'll wash their hands in very specific ways before the meal. Then they will say blessings. And before each kind of food, they'll say a blessing. And then after eating, they will also pray at length, and as well as with songs and so forth, so that the meal itself is really not so much and only about food, but about the fellowship and the activities and the gratefulness and the blessings that food and the table permits those who partake. And if you look at, with food practices within Judaism, of course, one of the most distinctive features is the strict regulations of what one eats and what one doesn't eat, and with whom one eats. And there was a concern among the rabbis that eating together of Jews with non-Jews would lead to a loss of communal identity. They understood very well the power and potential of food to bring people together. And they were very concerned as well then, as they were trying to consolidate their small, diasporic, dispersed communities, that they would put the table at the center of their family and communal life, and that then eating with others would be a very well reflected upon activity, that it happens, but it only happens under certain circumstances. The wine one drinks, for example, that one doesn't drink wine offered to idols. What's really behind that is probably, as the rabbinic sources make clear, that eating wine of pagans might lead to fraternity and fraternizing with pagans as well, and a loss of kind of the central features of what makes a Jew a Jew. And if we look back at where this comes from, it's really nowhere else than at the beginning of Jewish history within the Bible. And I think that I won't have to say so much about that because Professor Crane has done a wonderful job in laying out how food is very central to, already from the beginning pages, the verse chapters of Genesis, the commandment to eat from these trees, but not from these trees, and that the real change in the existential condition comes with the failure to really abide by those restrictions and the lusting after one kind of fruit. And that leads to then a loss of the garden and the ideal conditions under which one lives with food and plants and trees and so forth, as well as a vegetarian diet. And but some of the things I would like to bring out, and if maybe they'll be helpful for a discussion, maybe not, but one of, I think, the most important ones is the way that the biblical traditions can be mined for wisdom that is not necessarily bound to a specific Jewish practice. I think that one of the things as we go forward, as well as perhaps what Deanna will do with and her colleagues within the LAMP project, is to look at how religious traditions have a real power to bring us, to remind us of things that have been lost and within a society that no longer has strong rituals around the table, and but as well as also the ethics related to food production and the treatment of animals. One of the texts that I worked on and that I found most fascinating was a law from the book of Deuteronomy, and it relates to the cutting down of fruit trees during siege warfare. It's a very strange law, but it says when you go out against your enemies and the city won't capitulate, you shall not cut down their fruit trees. Why is that one of the prohibitions? All kinds of other very practical things, but fruit trees, really? Devote so much space to that? What was behind that? So it says you can cut down trees that do not bear fruit in order to build a rampart or something. But what you don't do is go hacking down their orchards. What was behind it was a concern among the besieging army to facilitate the capitulation, to expedite it by saying, look, we're going to tear down your life support system. And orchards that took many years to bear fruit were a central part of the life support systems. So that when you go to war, that you cannot attack a fruit tree. And it says at the very end, is the tree a human, that it comes out against you? That you should treat it in a violent manner? And that law is at the heart of a project of war laws that Grotius in 1625 in his writing in exile in France, this Dutch philosopher started to mine biblical as well as Greek pagan sources, as well as other kind of philosophical traditions and Indian traditions and so forth, to lay out some of the norms by which armies should treat the life support systems of their enemies. And that law was very central to it. One could compare it to another law in Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy has a lot of beautiful wisdom, what we call legislated wisdom, kind of things that we take for granted, but it's put into legal form, thou shalt not, rather than just a proverb. And one of them is the treatment of the mother bird. And the mother bird, the law says when you're on the road and you come across a nest on the road, you may shoo away the mother and take the egg or take the fledgling, but do not take both. So what is the concern? That you may live long in the land, that you may go well with you and they may live long in the land, the promised land. So there's a concern for how one goes about treating the natural structures. We might find that law still difficult, many still do, but an intention and a will to think about, well, what will be the best practice to enable human flourishing in the land in perpetuity is really what drives that. And these laws can be compared to a number of other laws related to farming and to the treatment of animals. Most maybe prominent farming laws that we know within the Christian tradition, perhaps many of you know, are about the edges of your fields, that you leave the borders of your field, the corners literally of the field, not harvested, unharvested, so that what? The poor among you may go about and actually physically do the act of harvesting and take food for themselves. And in combination with those laws are the laws that relate to animal rights. And a lot of work within Hebrew Bible that we do at Emory and so forth is really mining the biblical literature for views of ecology and animal rights. And there's a lot to be done there. The Bible does not have a modern, secular, very positivistic kind of approach to animals as well as the land and the natural elements of the whole biosphere. But rather it sees them all as cohering and that they all have a role to play, and that somehow they're conscious of their role. So that with animals, for example, they are commanded, or the owners are commanded to give them a rest during Shabbat, during the Sabbath. They're not to work. They're supposed to keep the Sabbath just along with their masters. And then you know of maybe the scene where Jonah preaches to the city of Nineveh, and we're told that the whole city was in sackcloth and ashes, as well as the cattle. It's a funny scene, but it really shows that there's a society exists along with the animals that supports it, and that when they all come together to do something, the animals are naturally thought with them. Think about also the story of the flood as well that Jonathan Crane mentioned. The flood is not just the violence of humans, but of all living flesh, of animals as well, that the world is destroyed because all of human nature, or all of living things, both humans and non-humans, had given itself to some kind of activity that we're not really sure about. The important point here is, though, that the Bible at the core of these major texts places animals together with humans in a kind of relationship with the divine. And that it's, yes, of course, one of the central Genesis texts says that humans should watch over or rule over the rest of creation, but that ruling over is unpacked in ways that are not in strict accordance with how the law of dominion has been developed within Christianity. Now, one of the things about Judaism and the development of Christianity, and I had an interesting discussion with Beth Corey about this over lunch, and with regard to really the beginning of Christianity, it was much less a theological discussion as more of a question of table fellowship. And table fellowship became the central kind of dividing line between those who would remain Jews and those who were going to adopt a Christian identity. And within Christian tradition, once the laws and the regulations of Leviticus, of what one should eat and what one should not eat and when one should eat, and all of these very minutia of dietary restrictions, once they were thought to belong to the old order and that they no longer applied for the Christian present, there was lost with that a body of knowledge that was inscripturated in a very progressive way that many other societies did not have. The book of Leviticus is a gift. And of course, it's very difficult. It has all these kinds of weird laws. But nevertheless, the presence and the fastidious attention to what one eats and what one consumes and how one creates an environment for the flourishing of one's foods was regained through various processes in the Christian tradition, but it doesn't have the same kind of canonical, primordial, scriptural status that we have within Judaism. And there's perhaps something to learn from the Jewish tradition in this regard. And just in closing, I would say that the vision that of a new creation that really is, it's not the Bible is only concerned with fellowship and identity and the Jewish people and keeping them separate from other peoples, but also a vision for that the creation will be one day renewed, and there will be a new relation of the human order to the natural order, to the animal order, as the laws of, or the prophecies that we know of the taking of the sword and making to the plowshare can be aligned with those that envision the perfect world order, and that is when everyone lives under his or her own fig tree and lives in peace. And that there is this kind of, I think, a very, I couldn't help but comparing it to the individual farms that one has, and that's where the programs for urban farming that we heard about this morning. And I think that I want to call all of you to perhaps look at the biblical tradition within the Jewish tradition, but also other religious traditions in the afternoon that we have here, as perhaps a powerful memory of a past way of living, a past way of relating to food. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wright. Next, I want to bring up to the podium Dr. Jennifer Ayres, who's an assistant professor of religious education at Emory's Candler School of Theology. She's the author of 2 books, Waiting for a Glacier to Move, Practicing Social Witness, and also Good Food, Grounded Practical Theology. Her current research investigates the educational task of cultivating Christian faith and how it is rooted in an ecological context. So, welcome very much to Dr. Ayres.
I thought I understood technology. I think I don't. Thank you so much, Deanna, for this invitation, and to all of my colleagues. I've enjoyed so much this conversation, and it's given me a lot of food for thought, much of which I wish I'd had before I wrote the book, Good Food. But better late than never. Food matters. It matters so much that one can hardly think of a major life event in which food is not a central feature. It often is a memorable main character in film. Take Soul Food or Babette's Feast or Julie and Julia, for example. Just on a human level, food nourishes, bonds, inspires, celebrates, heals, soothes, and connects. In my own Southern childhood, we'd take lazy suppers out on the back porch, wholly made of fresh vegetables from plants in the backyard or a roadside produce stand. Family members would share laughter and tell tall tales late into the evening sunlight. Such meals would fortify the affective bonds between sisters and brothers, between parents and children. They were a ritual of sorts, and they remind me that food shows us not only something about our social relationships, but also something about our relationship to a good God who provides these gifts for us. In many ways, then, the table is a site for divine encounter. And yet, before we wax too theological, we are caught because suppers from the farm stand are not actually a simple and accessible meal for so many in the United States. Struggling farmers have difficulty making a living growing produce. Migrant workers are paid very little and suffer difficult and sometimes abusive working conditions in the fields. In many communities, both urban and rural, even sorry excuses for fresh vegetables may not even be available, or priced so high that it costs more to buy a single tomato than to buy a fast food hamburger. And I haven't even touched on the other crises in our food system: abused animals, stripped soil, and abandoned rural communities, for example. These also challenge simple theological affirmations of divine encounter in the food system. So when we talk about food, we encounter both a God who creates and provides, as well as the brokenness and alienation in the system. In the Christian tradition, the site of this confrontation is a table around which Christians orient themselves on a regular basis. Whether they gather around this table weekly, monthly, or quarterly, old school Presbyterians, Christians share a simple and sacred meal together, comprising the most basic fruits of the earth, bread and wine, which recalls and re-instantiates in gathered community the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The World Council of Churches has said that this meal, which recalls the last meal shared by Jesus with the disciples, is contextualized by all of the meals that Jesus shared with people, including the feeding of the 5,000, which Dr. Crane introduced us to just a few moments ago. And I would add, it also is contextualized by a multitude of texts in both the Hebrew Bible and in the Christian New Testament about food and agriculture and animals. This food matters. That the earliest Christian communities experienced conflict around the communion meal suggests that for them, as well as for us, for contemporary Christians, the table is the core of theological and moral knowing. It matters, born as it is in this central symbol and practice. How does this table theology then respond to and make sense of our food system? My own research and constructive work as a Christian practical theologian, thinking about the food system brings me to at least 3 core affirmations that orient the Christian faith. First, when Christians refer to this communion meal as the Eucharist, they acknowledge its literal meaning. Who knows the literal meaning of Eucharist? Anyone? Thanksgiving, thank you. Thanksgiving. They express their thanksgiving for God's gifts, and in gratitude, they also promise to distribute those gifts justly. The principle of just distribution means that both the benefits and the costs of the food system should be shared equitably. It means that Christians cannot then ignore serious issues of food insecurity in poor rural communities or poor urban communities, nor can they ignore unjust wages and working conditions for agricultural laborers. Second, Christians are reminded at the Eucharistic table that the meals that Jesus shared with his friends served to proclaim and enact the nearness of the kingdom of God, signifying a vision of an alternative future in which God restores relationships among persons, communities, and the earth, in which death does not have the last word, not in the tomato fields, not in concentrated animal feeding operations, not in a so-called food desert, not in the global farming crisis. I think this is a great challenge, quite frankly. In the face of so many challenges, what prevents any of us, any person of conscience, from giving up, from giving in to despair? But today I want to think a little bit more intentionally about the third theological affirmation, that the Eucharist is, at its core, about belonging and membership. Christians approaching the Eucharistic table might, in other contexts, in other meals, experience a great distance between their eating and the lives of farmers and laborers, agriculture, and even other people who are eating. Eating is something we often do alone, perhaps out of a takeout container, and one could hardly identify the origins of this meal or the conditions under which it was prepared. But Paul reminded the Corinthians that in this Eucharistic meal, Christians are bound to one another. His admonition to, quote, discern the body immediately follows his description of the church as the body of Christ. But when we think about food as a commodity, something we buy, then our responsibility goes no further than paying a market price for that commodity. The Eucharist reminds Christians, in contrast, that they are not mere consumers. They are together members of a community, members of Christ's body, of the global communion, and indeed members of God's body, the earth. In an alienating world which dismembers all participants in the food system, the Eucharistic table is a site of remembering. And that consciousness of membership in God's household serves as a lens by which Christians might understand all their eating. So this is the theological imagination that is cultivated, I think Christians argue, at the Eucharistic table, where they learn 3 things: that God is the giver of all good gifts, and that we are to distribute those gifts justly, In this meal, Christians are offered a glimpse of the kingdom of God, God's alternative future of abundance and vitality, and that Christians are members of Christ's body, the church, and God's body, the earth. Now, of course, I'm speaking as a Christian practical theologian, but I think that these themes resonate across religious traditions, and I'm grateful for my colleagues who are showing us how that's the case. I think this table of theology gives rise to 4 moral commitments, and I'll conclude with those. First, participants are convicted of the priority of the hungry. Biblical norms regarding leaving food for the poor, as my colleague Dr. Wright just mentioned, are at the center of some of these texts about feeding. An abundant feast, such as the one that we symbolize in the Eucharist, convicts, I think, religious communities wherever whole communities around their congregations have little or no access to fresh, healthy, and affordable food. And rural families living in the U.S. agricultural heartland are food insecure. Second, participants must seek justice for those who work the land. When Christians receive the bread and the cup, they receive in their bodies the fruits of the labors of farmers and agricultural workers in the U.S. and around the world. Farmers and agricultural laborers are, however, poorer and more likely to face food insecurity and nutritional-related illness than persons with other vocations. Third, participants receive a charge to tend the earth. Christians consume in this sacred meal simple fruits of the earth, wheat and grapes, insofar as the earth yields these fruits that they bless, break, and share. It demands gratitude and reverence. And yet we live in a time in which our agricultural practices are anything but restrained, depleting the soil and exploiting animals. Finally, all 3 of these moral commitments depend upon one deeper, more fundamental orientation. It requires the cultivation of a keen sense of the interdependence, the interrelatedness of humanity and the soil. If one receives no other moral demand from the Eucharistic table, it is this one: the radical gift of the membership in the body of Christ demands the Christian's sacred obligation to continually seek, tend, and nurture the bonds of connectedness in God's whole creation, with other humans, with other living creatures, with the soil. This work is hard in our alienated context, but in my research I have heard story after story of practices of food justice that embody this keen sense of connectedness. Like farming in the churchyard in the midst of what others have called a desert, or traveling to Mexico to witness the struggles and innovations of traditional farmers, or like hosting a farmer's market, or supporting the rights of workers, or touching and cultivating the earth. In these practices, hope is born. At their heart, these instances of fragile goodness and interdependence stand as a witness to the sin and brokenness that characterizes the food system, that make truly good food a near impossibility. But they also serve as windows of grace, demonstrating care for the poor, dignity for the laborer, reverence for all forms of life, and a way of life deeply related to others, to God, and to the earth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have Sumayya Allen, who is a certified permaculture designer, an urban agriculturalist, and an educator here in Atlanta. She's earned her degree in environmental science from Emory University, and she's currently completing a master's in agroecology at the University of Florida. As a permaculture designer, she's worked with sustenance design, applying ecological principles in the conscious design of diverse, resilient, productive, and beautiful landscapes. And currently, she works as a community agriculture programming and design specialist with Farmer D consulting projects, consulting on projects across the United States. Please welcome to Sumayya Allen.
Thank you. Thank you. Peace unto you all. I'm very honored and grateful to be here. So I'm going to be really taking a personal approach as to how certain faith-based concepts have informed my own work in community agriculture. So I've spent the past approximately 5 years working in urban agriculture here in Atlanta on various initiatives and projects with, for example, Truly Living Well and Global Growers Network. But really, my first experience in sustainable organic agriculture was about 20 years ago, where I spent a summer working on a Pueblo reservation on a project called the San Juan Organic Agricultural Cooperative. It was through that experience, really, that I got hooked into this work and was like, this is what I'm going to do the rest of my life. And primarily because there was, basically, I received this fundamental understanding of agriculture as a system that was much more complete and interdisciplinary than what I had gone into it thinking. So initially, I went into it, and as many people go into it, thinking about it in this field-based scale, right? So this scale of like, how do we produce more food, right, on a specific area of land. But really, when you talk about agriculture, it's not just the how-tos. It's not just how do we do this? How do we do this to care for the earth? But also we have to think about who are we doing this for? Who is it for? Why are we doing this? It's to feed people and the people who are doing it. Who is it that's actually doing the work? There's an honor of culture and traditions that needs to play into that whole system and that we need to really take to heart when we think about agriculture. Again, you can't remove that culture from agriculture, so you have to take that in and really understand. So that was, for me to have that as my first experience was really quite formative for my future in really kind of understanding these social dynamics and cultural dynamics that go into growing food. So a few years after that, I began studying Islam and actually converted to Islam around that time. And one of the concepts from early on that really resonated with me was the concept of Khalifa. And that concept of Khalifa is of earth guardians or earth stewards. In Islam, in Islamic tradition, humankind was given this intellect that other creation does not have. And with that intellect, we have responsibilities. And one of those responsibilities is actually to care for the rest of creation, to take care of it, to tend to it. And so assuming that role, now obviously like the way that, our post-industrial society now, so many of us are so disconnected from the earth, from the natural environment, that we don't really understand what that role is. We don't really understand what it is to take care of and to tend and to be stewards of the earth because we're not connected to it. So this has really kind of informed a lot of my work. So how can I better educate others to connect and to be involved and to be part of that system, the ecological system, because humans are part of the food chain. We're part of this greater ecological system. So how do we get back into that? How do we connect ourselves again? So I find this kind of influencing me and driving me to do the work that I'm doing in developing community agriculture and trying to get people to connect back to the natural world. So Khalifa, the concept of Khalifa basically translates again into stewardship or guardianship. The resources that the earth produces are all to our, we can use these resources, right? We have to use these resources. God provided these to us, to humankind, for food, for shelter. All of these things we can gain, are produced from the earth. So we have to understand that this concept of Khalifa is of using things in a sustainable way. So I know that's kind of a tricky term there, but in a way in which we are moderate and we're balanced with using the resources that the earth provides. And so the concept of stewardship is to be able to manage that use without overusing, without exploitation, without degradation of land. And we see now today, so much of the agricultural land has been degraded. We're losing all this arable land because we're just using, and we're not giving anything back. So there's no regeneration. So taking this concept into what it is to provide for this regenerative building of systems, right? So as most of us are so disconnected from not just the natural world, but from our food system, that it's almost impossible. I would challenge anybody to say, how can you steward something that you're ignorant of or that you don't know the value of that? Do we understand the intrinsic value of nature? Do we understand what it takes to cultivate the earth and to take care of the soil to produce the food that we consume? If we don't understand this, how can we really take care of it? So I strive to facilitate this connection primarily. I believe that through connecting, even just from an individual point of view of like going into your backyard and being able to recognize what's going on back there, observing the natural world, observing the habits of the different species that we're sharing our place and space with, that cultivating these type of experiences will help us to become stewards and help us to assume that role once again of stewards of the earth. And by growing food, that's like one of the best, most easy ways, I guess, to really put that into action, as we actually assume that role as a steward when we cultivate the earth and we grow food. So by going out into a backyard, for example, and growing food in a backyard, we're assuming that responsibility already as a steward. We recognize when we plant a seed that we have to care for that. We're going to have to put some type of care in it. We're not removed from that anymore. Once we take that step, we're not removed from it. So we're already starting to connect. We're already starting to reconnect. So we have to care for it. We have to see, what does it need? Is the soil healthy enough to help sprout this seed? Once it starts growing, we start looking at the plant. Oh, what are these insects that are on the plant? Is it harming it? Is it doing beneficial good? What is it doing? And we start researching it. We start recognizing and identifying the insects. We start looking up, oh, it has some type of disease. What's going on here? Is this something based off of the soil? So again, we're reconnecting to what it is that's producing that food. And in the end, we get the fruits of our labor, right? After we've helped and we've cared for that piece of land that's growing that food, and we've cared for that creation, we've reconnected, right? So the other thing, in Islam, there's also a hadith, a saying of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in which anyone who plants a tree or sows a field and somebody or a bird or animal eats of that, they receive the blessings of charity. So this is another real concept that really sits with me about, why is it that why is it that I want to do this work? Why is it important to do this work? This is this concept of generational charity. So establishing reconnection in this place-based education really is the key to kind of going back and assuming this role of stewards of the earth. Because if we can begin to observe and identify the natural world and be part of that natural world, then we will start feeling that connection again. We will start reestablishing that. And you cannot, once again, I really challenge you, can you care for something that you don't know exists, or that you don't know the value of that? So once we begin to start understanding what the value of the earth is, what the value of the soil is, what the value of the food that's produced from that soil is, we start really removing this veil of not just, is it, what we're participating in, but then we start questioning, well, where is this particular food, where's the coffee that I'm drinking coming from? And who's doing that growing? And is it degrading the earth? Is it helping? Is it regenerating the earth, or is it degrading the earth in the process of making this? So we start questioning, we start wondering and asking these questions about how the food that we eat and we consume, how is it produced, who's doing it, and we start becoming much more concerned with that process. So that in turn, I believe, is really what kind of brings people back into assuming this stewardship, this role, this active role of stewarding the environment and the earth. So cultivating this sense of place is really key a sense of place, cultivating an understanding of where everything comes from, where our food comes from, and then therefore taking that local and expanding it to global is really where we can begin to pay more attention and be more conscious of what it is that we consume, but also that we start taking that role of caring, actually actively stewarding, actively being guardians of the earth and its resources. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sumayya. Next up, we have Pramod Parajuli, who is coming to us, born and raised in the Nepalese Himalayan foothills, although I believe he's coming from Arizona this time. Professor Parajuli is an award-winning sustainability educator, a visionary, and curricular and social innovator. He currently serves as associate faculty for the PhD program in sustainability education at Prescott College in Prescott, Arizona. And he's co-editor of the forthcoming book, Religion and Sustainable Agriculture, World Spiritual Traditions and Food Ethics. So please welcome to Professor Parajuli.
Go to the first. Yes, that's it. I really want to thank Deanna and Joanna and the team at Georgia Tech and Emory University. I also want to acknowledge two of my PhD advisees from Prescott College, Tiffany and Kent. Could you say hello to everyone? Prescott College is a very small college struggling to survive in a kind of a massive corporatization of higher education, but we have good traditions of students remaining in the community and the advisors visiting them. That's part of and thank you for bringing me to Atlanta. What I have thought of doing is, I have some slides, but I want to first read a paragraph so that then I don't get lost into the message and the slides. So I decided to title this talk, Earth-Bounding Faith, a story of soil to supper, and I put a slash, sustenance pedagogy. So I'm basically bringing in pedagogical, anthropological, and ecological perspective, and hopefully you will find the transdisciplinary nature of what I'm saying. So what is the use in thanking God for food that has come at an unbearable expense to the world and other people? This is a provocative question posed by no other than a very religious person and Christian and son of the soil, Wendell Berry. Many of you, most of you, all of you know Wendell Berry, and he has been very influential in my own work. Then we have a French philosopher, Bruno Latour, who wrote the book, We Have Never Been Modern, which resonates with peasant part of me. What use is it to save our soul if we forfeit the earth? Asked Bruno Latour. So I'm kind of inspired by this opening from these two serious thinkers of our time. Indeed, where is the faith in what I call the soil to supper / sustenance pedagogies, which you will see in the slides? What about the existing faiths? I am a Hindu Buddhist, Christians, Judaism, Islamic. We heard a lot of wonderful things about stewardship in all those traditions. Existing faiths and even interfaith collaboratives. While sharing the stories around learning gardens, I will propose a potential ideas, and there are 6 kind of transitional thought areas that I would like to share with you. Potential ideas such as pluri-species, rather than a human is Homo sapiens sapien, or even multi-species. Earth-bounding, let's see how far I can explain that. And also a regenerative reciprocity, or you could call hospitality. What if we imagine a food, farming, and the faith trio in which soils are rich and are dancing with more life while pollinators are pollinating and have enough to go around and multiply. What if a sacred thread binds and nature and culture are coupled and co-constitutive in this drama? With care and elegant design, could such a food and garden-based learning system achieve abundance, beauty, as well as sacredness? And it has been a very fertile day for me to jot down. I think we are in a period of massive transition about not only what we eat, but how we are thinking, or how we might be thinking. So let me propose to you 6 transitions. First of all, I think the food insecurity / hunger, let's transition from that idea to the idea of regenerative abundance. Not just abundance, but a regenerative kind that regenerates the human equality and respectability with each other, and also regenerates the capacity of the earth to feed itself, all species, including us. The other one that I have been really waiting to hear from my colleagues is the word peasant. Before farmers, there were peasants, and I am one of them. I'm still a peasant in my thinking and in my being, because my family still practices subsistence agriculture in the foothills of the Himalayas. So yes, there was a massive de-peasantization. Remember the peasant to proletariat, and we are all 3rd generation, 4th generation of that being proletariat. But do you think, or am I wrong, that there is a re-peasantization among the generation of Sumayya Allen, among the Rashid Noori? We are beginning to go back to the land, not as a commodity, but as something we want to engage in for our survival, for our life. That I call re-peasantization. And if you look at all over the world, I think what is happening is re-peasantization, where people locally will eat from the hand of their own labor. And that's what Mahatma Gandhi was talking about, that you should earn your bread labor. So and I also work in the Andes and the Amazon. There, the Spanish word is chacareros. Chacra, that's their farming field, and they call it chacarero. And what is very exciting today is the emergence of a new class of people. I call it urban chacareros, who farm, garden on rooftop and your porch. Even food is grown more in cities now than in rural villages. You might want to notice that. So the third one I would like to see as a shift is that we were, in the industrial food system, we were differentiated between the producer and the consumer. And that discussion has come a lot today. But what is emerging, actually, is prosumers, that we each are capable of being both the producer and the consumer. And Burlington, Vermont is one of the fascinating examples of that, where there are not only community-supported agriculture, but actually community-supported restaurants. And I ate in one of them, and it feels like that creation of the food set, that stewardship and responsibility between the producer and consumer, and not a division that I should also be producing and I should also be consuming. So that's the third departure. The other one that is very relevant, and I think we have to really figure out, is our agriculture, the mainstream agriculture, chemical agriculture, is of course climate disrupting. Now we want to do agriculture that is climate smart. Not only adapts to the getting hotter temperature earth, but which actually captures that carbon dioxide and turns that into the nutrient for soil and food, and which, if I have time, I will explain to you through a system called biochar that many peasants are now beginning to use that. So along with it comes a knowledge dimension of what does it all mean, and I have named it from the idea of a university, which assumes a certain kind of a unified knowledge among mostly the European or the Hindu scholars like my grandfathers and mothers, to pluriversity, where not only the human species are learning, teaching, and performing, but all species are performing, are actors, are teachers, are students. So in a biblical way, let us bring all the species in that commensal table. You see? And what kind of learning would that be? And I see a little bit of mirror of that in the learning gardens. So the other one I have come up to share with you is, there is in America mostly, America, Australia, and England, there is this idea of outward bound, because we are alienated from nature, let's go camping, canoeing, tararara. I think we have to shift that. I would suggest, what about homeward bound? How to become a good householder? Not going out, but going in the household, doing what you get from inward bound and outward bound, being a better household. So these are the things I want to share with you. Conceptually, now we go. So how do I just press the button? So this is the Learning Gardens Laboratory in Portland, Oregon. I was there for 10 years, and that's where most of my work on Learning Gardens began. And now I'm, continuing that in Kenya. Oh, could you put that? Yeah. In the Amazon and Prescott, and also probably, hopefully, creating that Annapurna pluriversity. Annapurna means, have you heard about Annapurna mountain range? All of you go for trekking. That actually means abundance. That we look at the pile of snow on Annapurna, and then we predict what kind of harvest is it going to be. So these are the third grade children in Portland, one of the elementary schools, and you can see why is it that they really want to learn. Should I just press it? Yeah. Okay. So, did I miss something? I think I did. So, here is one of the way I'm looking at it is, Wendell Berry again has a sentence who says, eating is an agricultural act. So as an anthropologist and as an educator, I begin to say, wow, this sentence is profound, but there is more to it. So I extrapolated it. Agriculture is an ecological act. Without all ecological drama, there will be no good agriculture, right? Then ecology is a pedagogical act. And pedagogical act can be a transformational act. So this is how I'm combining the ecological principles, agricultural principles, and learning principles. So let me then go to the second slide. Yes, on the basis of that, what I am thinking, and I went through a lot of revolutionary generals, from Che Guevara to Mahatma Gandhi to Mao Zedong to you know who. But finally I realized, come to the terms, that it might be as simple as food, that we can create the kind of world that we want to create, but not by fighting and not going to the hospital and not getting sick as an activist, but deeply nourishing and delicious, both in society, culture, and your own life. So, deep and delicious pathways to social transformation that you already always wanted to achieve, I think can be achieved through food, soil, agriculture, gardening. So I want to share with you, this really happened in 2005 in Portland, Oregon. These were the fourth grade kids from a Buckman Elementary School. What I am fascinated by is they were given a plot to work on, 4 by 6 for each student, and then as big as this for 25 students in a class. When they were digging it for their grade, they found the earthworm, but they just did not say, oh, here is an earthworm, right? They picked it up and let it wiggle in their palm and hands. So now imagine what will happen to these 4 kids when they will grow up. What kind of life they will begin to pursue? What will be their priorities? Wouldn't they become more ethnobiologists? Wouldn't they become much more oriented to the life laboratory rather than a concrete laboratory? You see, they might kind of enjoy doing regenerative work. And that is why, I think I heard something that we have to start this work early in childhood. So I already did that. So now you see, you can have harvest, learning, and these are my team of university students, which they became the garden educators. Now, there is a Fritz of Capra's idea about what is life, right? Basically what we learn from nature is it sustains life. But human social system, we have compromised that capacity. We lost something that we do not follow what nature can do. So how to reorient human social systems to be able to sustain life. So that's how my students are working on that kind of a model, including these 2. Now I am kind of giving you a learning, what might happen to the learner, the child, the youth in the gardens. And here comes the learning theory. One is, of course, the engagement, that the cognitive part is important, but not the only important. I want to emphasize that. Then enactment, that is the hand and all the other senses. Enablement, the heart of joy or anxiety if your plant doesn't grow, if your seed gets dried up. And I'm going to bring something from the Himalayas that the Americans don't want to talk about, the visceral vigor, this head, not this head. For me, I think from here, not from here. And that visceral vigor needs to be activated, and that happens with the food, garden, and agriculture. I call it the embodiment. Then you feel like, wow, this saliva is coming, gooey stuff is coming, that the civilization put it under the carpet. We need to bring it up as alternative, finding the satisfying life. Then empowerment, of course, that is very important, that the child wants that this is my plot, this is my companion planting, this is my marigold, like that. And sense of place, and then sense of wonder. And of course, you can add in other things. So those are the things I'm sharing with you. And one of the things as an anthropologist I am bringing to the Learning Gardens curriculum is the idea of biological diversity, linguistic diversity, and cultural diversity. And I think they are very important elements. And in a city like Atlanta, where all these cultures are coming from all over the world for you, that we need to make pluricultural gardens, not only just the broccoli, the cauliflower, the carrot, and I did that experiment in Portland by bringing multicultural parents to make their own garden in this facility. So just to give you an idea, humans co-evolve with 85 different types of plants. Just the rice is one of the 85,000. And how many varieties of rice are there? 400,000 varieties of rice are there. 5,000 varieties of potatoes. I saw hundreds of them in the Andes. They are still alive. There are 20,000 varieties of wheat. So think about the depth, the vertical depth of our geological and human history, and what our agricultural mind has created, that level of diversity. So that I urge you to bring it to your curriculum. Same way the seeds, and you have probably known the work of Bandhana Siva, among others. That is a very important work. And lastly, I want to end up with this idea of biochar, and I have a little sample in my bag, and when you are interested, it's just a charcoal, but it is prepared in a way without exposing oxygen when you are burning that biomass, either a twig or a leaf or a branch or wood, or even a sugar cane or a coconut. And it has such ability to activate the soil to come alive. And that most of the carbon dioxide that we have extra, if we use this technology and other regenerative agricultural technologies, we can sequester that extra carbon dioxide, and it's unbelievable, but we can actually take it all if we really do the regenerative agriculture. And one example is Polyface Farm in Virginia. Have you heard about it? If someone does agriculture like that all over Virginia, it will sequester all the carbon dioxide that US produces. So that's the kind of capacity we have in regenerative agriculture. And thank you so much.
Our final speaker for today, besides myself, is Professor Bill Winders, my colleague here at Georgia Tech. He's an associate professor of sociology in the School of History and Sociology. He studies national policies, social movements, and the world economy with a focus on food and agriculture. His book, The Politics of Food Supply, U.S. Agricultural Policy in the World Economy, won the 2011 Book Award for the Political Economy of the World System section of the American Sociological Association. And please welcome Bill.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Deanna, for organizing this and having me, inviting me to be a part of it. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity not only to have heard the fantastic presentations that came before, but also to participate in this way in this important and insightful symposium. And what I'd like to do for the brief time that I have is to bring something of a global perspective to the conversation and focus on the issue of world hunger and look at the ways in which world hunger connects to what I would call, and others would call, the political economy of grains, that is of corn and rice and wheat, the way in which they're used, the way in which they're traded, imported, and exported, and the way in which they're produced. In part because these grains are the basis of most diets around the world. So understanding their role in world hunger, or how they relate to it, I think is quite important. But before I do that, before I talk about grains per se, I wanted to say a little bit about world hunger. And the first thing that I want to say is that according to the World Food Program of the United Nations, there's an estimated, in 2015, there's an estimated 795 million people who are categorized as being undernourished or malnourished. To me, that's a lot, right? It's more than double the population of the United States. But this was actually something not necessarily to brag about, but this was an accomplishment from the viewpoint of some folks because it was the first time in modern systematic measuring of world hunger that the number of people hungry in the world fell below 800 million. And it's also an improvement over the last 25 years. It's a decrease of about 20% since the early 1990s. And as a percent of the world's population suffering from hunger, sorry, let me rephrase that. The percent of the world's population suffering from hunger has fallen over the last 25 years from about 23% to 13%. Right? Nonetheless, world hunger, 800 or almost 800 million people, is a significant amount. And world hunger, or hunger in the world, is disproportionately found in, not surprisingly, poorer countries, developing countries, especially in Asia and Africa. And there we can see, we'll see in just a few minutes, we can see the link between hunger and the political economy of grains. had this great map of world hunger, but I tend to get easily distracted, and with only 10 minutes, I thought I would get too involved with the map, so I went very bare bones for this presentation. So just imagine a map that has Africa and Asia highlighted, because I've already just wasted a minute talking about why I don't have that map. The last thing that I want to mention is why, right? That is how people try to explain, or the factors that they cite when they try to understand world hunger. And there's a variety of reasons that play into world hunger and that people focus on: poverty, war, political corruption, famine due to natural disasters, flooding and drought. But there's one factor that's very commonly cited, and that is agricultural production. That is the amount of food that we produce. In fact, The Economist magazine a few years ago, I think in 2009 when my book came out, they had a special insert that posed what was called the 9 billion people question, right? How would we be able to raise enough food to feed 9 billion people? And some people ask the same thing today. So the thinking goes, if only we, the world, could produce enough food, then we could alleviate world hunger. If this particular country in Africa or Asia or Latin America could produce enough food, then they could experience food security. So the solution to world hunger then becomes increasing the supply of food, often through, I'll mention this since we're at Georgia Tech, often through the use of technology, through hybrid seeds, genetically engineered seeds, chemical fertilizers, and so forth. But today I want to argue that the emphasis that's put on production is somewhat misplaced. That while food production is certainly important, that the increases in food production over the past 40 to 60 years have played an important role in the steady decline of world hunger and the relative improvement of food security in countries around the world. There's nevertheless some important elements of food security and world hunger that are not about production levels. And in some instances, for example, food security and world hunger often occur when there's adequate production. And in fact, food security and hunger occur even when a surplus exists. So understanding those situations is my focus today. And in many ways, the basic question that I'm asking is, how does the market, that is the world economy, shape grain production and distribution in ways that contribute to hunger? And I'm going to do that, I'm going to discuss this by focusing on two examples. And the first example that I'm going to focus on is food security in South Asia, in particular in India and Pakistan, two countries that have faced hunger and food security issues for a number of decades, and look at the role, or look at the presence of exports of grains in those countries. And the second example that I want to look at is the example of global meat consumption. And in terms of putting it in the context of the political economy of grains, looking at the competing, or I would just say really simply, the division between food grains and feed grains, that is how grains are used. And both of these examples, I hope, lead us back to one question, a question that has come up before: for whom are the grains produced? Right? For whom are the grains produced? And it's this question, I think, that gets at more, that takes us beyond the issue of production. So let me turn first to the example of food security and grain exports in South Asia. Food security in India and Pakistan, in particular, is considered to be serious, right? A serious problem. The International Food Policy and Research Institute for the last 25 years has tracked what it's called, has tracked world hunger and food security by using what it developed and calls the Global Hunger Index, the GHI. And the GHI, the Global Hunger Index, looks at three different factors. It looks at the percent of the population that's undernourished, the percent of children under the age of 5 who are overweight, and the mortality rate of children under the age of 5. And according to the Global Hunger Index, both Pakistan and India are rated as having food security issues that are, quote, serious. And as recently as 2009, they had they had food security statuses that were termed as alarming. And in each of the countries, approximately in 2013, approximately 17% of the population was categorized as being undernourished, just categorized as being hungry. And hunger in these countries is not, and food insecurity in these countries is not a new issue, but is an issue that has been faced for a number of decades. But over the past few decades, over the past, say, 30 years, wheat production and rice production, the two main grains consumed in Pakistan and India, have actually increased steadily. And wheat production, or rice production rather, in India, the primary grain in India is rice, and rice production at various points over the last 20 years has actually outstripped, has been greater than consumption of rice in India. And in Pakistan, somewhere along the line when I was in graduate school, I figured out how to work Excel really well. And you'll see, I hang on to graphs like a death grip. So in Pakistan, wheat is the main grain that's consumed, but I want to focus on rice for just a moment, because over the last 30 years, almost 50 years, the production of rice in Pakistan has increased. The production of rice in Pakistan has increased significantly to the point of doubling over since the early 1990s. So what has happened with this grain? Rather than being consumed, so I should go back for just 1 second. So the green line here, the gray line rather, is rice consumption in Pakistan, and the red line is rice production in Pakistan. And these two countries, which have experienced significant food security issues for several decades, and in very recent times, have exported significant amounts of the grains that they produce. In particular, in the midst of the most recent global food crisis in 2008, 2009, Pakistan had 77 million people who were categorized as suffering from hunger, which is approximately just under half of its population. But during that time, Pakistan exported record amounts of rice. Sorry, I gotta find it here. It exported almost half of, let me just read it. In Pakistan in 2008, 77 million people suffered from hunger, representing almost half of that country's population, and a 28% increase from the year before. And nonetheless, rice exports actually increased. And Pakistan exported about half of the rice that it produced in that year. And in fact, Pakistan's wheat exports for 2007 and 2008 reached record levels at about 10% of production, about 2.2 million metric tons in each year. That's nearly double the most that it had exported prior to 2007. And so the question that we need to ask then is, for whom are these grains, this rice and this wheat, being produced? Right? So let me switch quickly to the next example, which is that of global meat consumption. Meat consumption in the world has increased dramatically over the last 30 years. So you can see the numbers there. That since 1990, it's increased by almost 30%. And since 2000, it's increased by almost 14%. But because that's per capita, the blue line is total meat, the top line there is total meat consumption. Because it's per capita, it doesn't really capture the sharp increase in the resources that are dedicated towards meat production. So if we look at meat production in terms of million metric tons of different kinds of meat, and this shows cattle, chicken, pigs, and then the top line is total, since between 1990 and 2013, there's a 73% increase in the amount of meat in terms of million metric tons that was produced. And there's been a sharp number, because I'm vegan, I have to state this, there's a sharp increase in the number of animals that were killed for meat. About 60 billion chickens were killed in 2013, and about 1.4 billion pigs were killed in that same year. And this sharp increase in, sorry, that's too fast. This sharp increase in meat production leads to certain consequences in terms of the uses of resources such as land, water, and how grains themselves are used. And I want to return very quickly to the example of India, because India has been an unlikely source of increased meat production and slightly meat consumption, but especially exports over the past 20 years. So what this graph shows, the top line, the green line, is beef production in India since 1960, but if we pay attention to the last increase there, it's since 1995. And you can see for exports, and what I want to highlight here is that in this country, in India, where hunger and food security is a significant issue, what we find is that India is now the world's top exporter of beef. Right? It exports more beef than Brazil, Australia, or the United States, not combined, but each of them individually. Right? And this has implications for the use of land. So land had the amount of land dedicated to feed grains has expanded by as much as 50% over the last 20 years in India, which leads again to the question of for whom the grains are produced. So let me wrap up really quickly by just making these last 2 points. I'm just going to read them because my notes are a bit more jumbled. And I put text on it because I write it better than I say it. So the 2 important points I want to leave you with is that the market shapes grain production and distribution in ways that contribute to hunger. First, we can see it in terms of facilitating and prompting exports out of areas that would otherwise could use those grains to help feed a hungry population. And second, in terms of gearing the grain production towards high-value meat production and exports. And this then leads me to the conclusion about how the market can shape for whom grains are produced and where they end up. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Joe, could you come up here and mute the screen for me? I thought I would be able to do it, but it's not actually a familiar setup for me. Oh, woohoo. All right, so I'm just going to offer a few brief comments, and then I'll call our panelists up for a question and answer session. I'd like to thank all of the panelists in this session, and I just want to highlight for the audience, I imagine most of you noticed this, but the extremely interdisciplinary and interfaith origins that these speakers were coming from. I think we had 5 different sort of faiths or perspectives represented, as well as at least 4 different sort of professional disciplines that our speakers were coming out of. Which makes my job perhaps a little bit more challenging to try to find some connections or between these things, but nonetheless, I saw a couple. I also want to take sort of the moderator's priority here, or privilege to interject just a couple of historical insights that I think that I thought of while the panelists were speaking, that I think are germane or related to what we want to talk about today. First of all, agriculture is in some ways an ancient practice, but only if you think in terms of very recent history. So agriculture has really only been around for about the last 12,000 years, whereas humans have sort of been more or less acting like humans for at least 100,000 years, if not up to 1,000,000 years. So agriculture is a little blip in the longer timeline of our civilization. If the world didn't have farmers, there would still be humans here. They would be hunting and gathering, or they perhaps would be nomadic pastoralists. They would be doing different things. There would definitely be fewer humans, and they would also be doing different things with their time, which I'll get to in a minute. One of my favorite facts to give my undergraduates when I talk about the development of agricultural societies and the sort of centrality of agriculture in many parts of human civilization today is that agriculture may have been developed as a way for humans to produce surplus grain, not necessarily to eat, but to drink. So the production of alcoholic beverages is actually one of the main theories for why agriculture sort of caught on as a cultural practice in the Middle East 11 or 12,000 years ago when it was first developed. So this idea, you know, as we were talking about sort of bread and wine, I was really thinking about how fundamental the wine is too. There's not really, you know, that actually might have been one of the first thinkings, was to create a sort of, you know, sacred beverage. And the other thing that I wanted to point out here is that monotheistic religions come out of agrarian societies, and that's, you know, that's a really important, this idea of having a conversation about religion and farming together really makes sense, because one of the things that agriculture does is it frees up time for some members of a larger community to become scholars, to become religious scholars or other forms of scholars. And it also settles people in communities. If you're a hunter-gatherer or if you are a nomadic pastoralist, you're really moving around. You have very few things, very few possessions. You don't settle down in one place. If you're an agriculturalist, if you're a peasant or a farmer, you need to do that. You need to be in one place to tend your crops, to guard them. And that leads to first the creation of communities, and then to larger and larger populations in those communities, larger cities, literacy, the standing armies, all of these things. So, excuse me. So those are just two sort of big picture ideas here. Another thing that I was thinking about, as some of the speakers were thinking at least, was how this relates to my own research, which I won't go into in too much detail, I promise, but it's about 20th century famines and our responses to them. And one of the things that I was really thinking about is when you read accounts of survivors of famines, people who have lived through terrible hardship where you know, 10, 20, 30% of their community died in a widespread famine, one of the things they talk about, besides just the trauma of being extremely hungry, suffering from acute malnourishment, is the trauma of having the community break down. And the things that they remember often are people don't eat together anymore. Even families stop eating at a table together. They just, you know, if they acquire any food at all, they take it to a bed or to a corner of their house and they consume it there. People don't visit each other. People hide from their neighbors. There's no sense of neighborly ties. People stop attending religious services and things like that. That was actually, for most people's recollection of a famine, if they survived it, that was really one of the most traumatic things, that they feel like they became somewhat less than human because of that experience. And it had everything to do with sort of community and the communal ties that these once agrarian societies had that were tested and sometimes severely broken by the experience of a famine. And I was also reminded of something that the political scientist James Scott has said, which is just that peasants living in extreme poverty suffer from a kind of social death, where their poverty prevents them from hosting people at their house. We talked a lot about hosts and guests, and this idea of sitting down at a table, and just that, you know, perhaps these people can't afford the surplus food to have people in their house. Perhaps they're so poor they don't actually even have the furniture to offer people a chair and things like that. These are the kinds of extreme poverty that also lead to a kind of closing in, of not feeling like you can be a full part of your community in an agrarian society because of extreme poverty. So our panelists here today displayed a real diverse set of interests and explanations for us. I had never really thought of Deuteronomy as a sort of quartermaster's handbook, but I really liked that idea. We heard about the idea of stewardship, the solidarity of the table, the sanctity of gardens and their sort of healing power or their potential for that in the world, especially for children, and also the sort of damage that world markets can hold for thinking globally about this. I have a question sort of for our panelists in general, and this isn't something they should answer now, but perhaps during the rest of the larger Q&A, you'd like to think about this and address this, which is just that I saw sort of two big themes here that I think exist in opposition to each other. One of them is some of you described a sort of tradition of fellowship, the kinds of sort of bringing together and the joy, really, that food can bring to a community or to people sitting down at a table together. And then on the other side, almost the exact opposite, is the suffering that perhaps our modern industrial agricultural system causes for people who work within it, the suffering that's caused by a lack or the wrong kinds of food. And so I want to sort of oppose those two things, and sort of, I think partially because today has introduced this idea of faith and the sort of ethical and moral principles that we try to live our lives by. What should we do? I want to just challenge our panelists to sort of pick a group that you really think is in your own work, at least, most deserving of this kind of attention. I understand we're all idealists, we're all optimists, we want to heal the world. I think that a lot of, one of the things about all of these talks is that they were a little bit general, in part because we're trying to address a pretty broad set of values here. But if you had to choose one group, would it be your community, our community here in Atlanta? Would it be school children? Would it be, animals? I'm just very interested to hear where could we start the process of alleviating the most suffering and bringing the most fellowship or the most joy to the table, to the collective table in this set of topics. So with that, as my sort of question I've posed to the panelists, I'd like to invite them to come up here and sit down. If two of you, don't fight over them, but there's two microphones sitting in the dish there. If two of you would just grab those so we can be sort of ready for the Q&A session, that would be great, and I'll join you up here for a while.
I have probably a combination of comment and question for Dr. Wright. I was really struck by your identification of the role of war in some of the things that you were talking about, and the way that there at one point in time was some commitment to things that you don't do in war that have to do with system versus what individuals do to each other. And I was really struck by that, especially in the context of our current situation where starvation has become a weapon, where destroying the water supply has become a weapon, where chemicals destroying the air has become a weapon. And I just wondered what you thought about that discontinuity, or even when it might have happened, what kinds of conditions have pushed us over the edge, so to speak.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a great question. We've moved from a morality that opposes wanton destruction, collateral damage, that was really codified by Grotius in his book on laws of war and peace, and that he in turn drew upon biblical literature as well as Greek sources, and I mentioned also Indian sources, but above all the biblical tradition, to kind of remind the West that this is what we have to do when we're fighting against each other. What happened in terms of warfare is that one has to remember that wars fought the European community were considered of a different kind than those fought beyond Europe's borders. So that there was a different attitude towards the lands and the soils and the environments and ecologies and populations and the treatment of populations when we're fighting abroad beyond the European context. And that really is a remarkable feature of the 20th century when the West was fighting and non-Westerners. But it's very much embedded within the biblical tradition that here is the very fact that you're fighting means that you're fighting for something, for life. If you destroy the source of life for which you're fighting, why then are you fighting anymore? And yeah, I guess I should leave it at that. Maybe some others want to say something more about that. Does that help?
Hi, thank you for those presentations, which were really great. I have a question about language, I guess, and commonality in language, because it strikes me sitting here that when I'm at church with Jennifer, I talk about these issues with very different language than when I'm here at Georgia Tech as a PhD student. I use completely different language to talk about exactly the same thing. And I'm wondering if, I guess I'm just wondering your thoughts on language about the moral dimensions of these issues, and if there's a way of more successfully bridging different disciplines all looking at these issues around morality, even if it's not specifically faith, in a way that enables different perspectives to talk to each other a little more successfully, or I guess work in ways that are mutually supportive, if that makes sense.
I was really hoping someone else was going to answer that. So my own approach has been to work from within my own tradition and to remain very specifically rooted in my own tradition, because I feel that grounds it in a way so that I can then bring in conversation partners, for example, from environmental education theory or from food studies or sociology. And I think in terms of interfaith collaboration on these questions, that's a really important thing to hold on to. And I'll just name as another space in which I find myself trying to figure out what kind of language to use is when I am with environmental educators. I had an interesting experience at the Environmental Education Association conference in which there was a pretty clear perspective that adults in religious communities were not necessarily a major site of interest in terms of where we should be doing environmental education. And I'm not sure what that reflected in terms of what people think happens in religious communities, but I realized that my own theological language could shut down conversation in that case. But I do think that these sorts of issues that sort of transcend religious tradition, moral tradition, and cultures, I don't really see a way around remaining specifically rooted in our own traditions and reaching out. And so I guess I'm just saying I think it's a thorny problem, and every time I speak from a Christian practical theologian's point of view, I always feel like I need to show that I know these other languages, which you kind of have to do this work. But I am aware that it has sort of a parochial sound in some circles. So yeah, it's not an answer so much as an identification with the challenge. Someone else.
While working with school-age children, what we found is that even not only the religious words and language use is very important, and also even the academic. And then what we did then is we gave the camera to the children and said, make a photo and film about what is happening in this garden for you. and the kind of footage that they would imagine and film, you will not do that. So we should let the children invent new language and new mode. So it would be multimedia and also completely multiple senses. They will, one video I remember even now is that they threw some banana peels on the road and there, and then they walked on it and then flipped it and then laughed it. You see, they have a completely different, and as an educator, I would like them to invent their own language, and that we need to let go of what we inherited from Stanford or Michigan or Chicago, and let the children create their own language and use multiple intelligence and plurisenses and all that. So that has been much more rewarding than imposing our language.
More questions from our audience?
Hello, thank you all for your discussions. And I was curious, thinking about it from sort of a role of someone who would like to make decisions that help others have more food security. When we're talking about specifically food exports from other countries and sort of a local food movement and appreciation for the workers who are making the foods, is that a path? Like, are you saying if we eat more locally, if we sort of, where does that go for a personal consumer choice? Or is it trying to speak more broadly?
That's for me. That's a very good question, and it's a very tough question for me to answer, so I'll do my best. When I gave a very similar talk at a local university recently, afterwards they said, whenever I give a talk along these lines, I'm perfectly willing to say that I'm vegan and the number of animals that are killed, because it's just astonishing to me, 60 billion chickens. And then afterwards, the group that I happened to be talking to was a business school and some agricultural economists, and they immediately raised their hands when I was done and said, so do you want us all to become vegan? Do you think that that's going to solve the problem? And I got on the defensive and I said, no, I didn't say anything. If you draw that, that's your own conclusion, whatever. But then later, because I'm a very slow thinker, later I thought, oh, what I should have said was, because his point, so I'm going to get to your question. His point was that if his farmers in Germany stopped focusing on selling livestock and switch back to grains, then they wouldn't make enough money, right? They would be impoverished. And so I said, well, that's not really what I'm saying, but in essence, that's exactly what I was saying. That the problem, regardless of our individual choices, which I'll come back to, the problem is really the market economy and where the market guides production or guides exports. So we may, so part of it is about the system. So the sociologist in me always looks at the system to try and understand what the issue is. So if someone was to ask me, what should we do about, what can we do about that in terms of world hunger? There's some fundamental revolutionary change that has to occur, or at least some recognition that some food production should not be geared just towards the market. Right? On an individual level, because I'm a sociologist, I have much more difficulty answering that question from a sociological perspective because, like many sociologists, I'm stuck in a very structural focus where the power lies in the structure. But individually, I do my best to, one of the reasons why I don't consume meat is because of the implications that meat has for the resources that are used globally. That sharp increase in meat per capita meat consumption globally has profound implications for the way in which food is used. I try to eat locally, but it's not within my initial thought is to say it's not within everybody's reach to eat organic and eat locally, right? Economically, it's not within everybody's reach. But then again, the panel this morning, like Rashid Nuri and Truly Living Well Farms, locating in communities that benefit from that kind of activity from urban agriculture could prove me wrong. So I've meandered a lot, and it's very difficult, I think, on an individual level to say what to do. I would say, I guess, if I'm just going to be forthright, just go vegan.
I'd like to jump in on that as well, though, because I think really those two issues are like comparing apples to oranges. Because when you talk about the local food movement, we're not producing commodity crops in the local food movement. We're not producing our rice. We're not producing our corn. We're not producing our wheat. So when we talk about local food production, we're talking about horticultural crops. We're talking about lettuce. We're talking about kale. We're talking about tomatoes. We're not talking about sugar. We're not talking about these commodities which we have to get elsewhere. So unless the local food movement really changes and begins to look at production of those commodity crops and how can I produce the grains that I need, the sugar, these commodities that we all have to have, or we all think we need to have. I mean, unless we're going to go raw food, these are products that we need to have, and they're not produced in our local food system. So I do think it's kind of looking at two different things. Again, the other side of the coin, when we look at dealing with hunger and food security issues internationally, we have to look at what are they producing. So like what Rashid had mentioned earlier with the largest sector of agriculture in Georgia being a place that is most food insecure and the worst diet, that's because the food that they're producing is not food for human consumption, right? So it's for commodity, it's for processing, into other things, so that they're not going out and eating their peanuts out in their field, right? They have to go to a grocery store to get their food because what they're producing is not something that they can directly consume. And the same thing can be said for these international, in other countries like India and Pakistan, where they're producing these grains that are for export use and for processing, not for consumption. So it's about diversification. If we want to really support and, address the issue of food security internationally, we have to look at supporting an agricultural system, an agroecological system that is producing food, a diverse array of food that is providing nutritional requirements to feed the people who are there. So really supporting that small-scale agriculture, and I guess addressing grain production is just a whole other monster.
Thank you very much. I've been instructed to keep us on time here, and so it is time for us to end the Q&A part. I'm sure the panelists would love to make themselves available after our closing remarks, but it is time for those now. So if I could invite you to step down and invite Jonathan Crane back up here for just a few brief remarks here at the end of our symposium today. Please, take it away.
Thank you. Could I have the projector again, please? And do you have the dongle? This is my dongle. Uh-oh. Oh, I could go from this one. Need the camera. Okay. So thank you. This has been such a rich day of conversations, and one of the things that I think that we've all highlighted is that food, farming, and faith is so complex that no one individual, no one discipline, and no one school can adequately or exhaustively treat these issues. That we all need to be at the proverbial table having a mutual conversation regardless of our discursive differences, going back to the PhD question, that we have a certain language in our theological communities versus our academic communities versus our activist communities. Regardless of those language, not barriers, but perhaps challenges, we nonetheless need to all be working together, and I commend the LAMP program for bringing us all together. It also demonstrates some of the themes that we've been talking about today, which is what does it mean to be, we need to re-narrate what it means to be consuming creatures of this world. And right now we know ourselves as Homo sapiens. And we should recognize that Homo sapiens, that term, sapere, sapiens, has two valences. On the one hand, we get from it savvy and savant. In other words, we understand ourselves to be that creature which is really wise and knowledgeable. Sapere also has another term, another connotation, which means to savor, to taste. We are that creature which is a tasting animal. We are a tasteful creature. And that is how we want to understand ourselves. We want to literally cultivate ourselves as encultured people. And that term cultivate also has an agricultural base as well from cultiv, which means to till the soil. So a culture cultivates, and we are acculturated into that culture by literally tilling the soil of our personas, of our characters. What I suggest throughout all of this is that perhaps we have cartographical challenges. And there are three different cartographical challenges that I think that, that we are facing in this conversation. The first one is theological. Which creation story do we invoke when we think about ourselves in this cosmos? Do we invoke that story of human exceptionalism that many of our contemporary politicians like to invoke? Or do we invoke that theological story of human embeddedness that many here seem to champion? That we are embedded in a broader, messier world, and we can't really claim exceptional or exceptionalism in that. And these choices locate us in a cosmological map. And those choices then will frame and constrain our moral choices, our political choices, and obviously our eating choices as well. But it emphasizes what kind of sense of specialness we have for ourselves. This here is the OT map, a circle with a T in the center, and you can see the three different continents that were of significance back then. And this is one way to understand the world. It locates the center of the world is certainly going to be Jerusalem. And here's another version of that OT map, also known as the petal map, that dominated ancient to medieval cartographers. And so then this gets to the second kind of challenge, cartographical challenge that I think that we face here, and that is the sociological and political map of the world. Insofar as we create maps of the world, putting on them those things that we consider to be important, those things that matter. And for the most part, the maps that we have been creating of late, civilizationally, are ones that highlight economic entities like industries, economies of trade, those things that matter. We map communities and classes. And predominantly, we map what human beings are doing. We map our cities, we map our churches and our mosques, we map our countries and our counties. We map the stuff that is very narcissistic. We map us. And perhaps what we need to do is take a lesson from the bees that we saw this morning. They don't map about where other beehives are. They map where their food is. And perhaps we need to redirect the way that we map the world. And so in the 20th century, we really we changed the way that we map the world again by looking at what is out there, very data-oriented. But one of the challenges with such maps is the granularity. How far back do we go? Do we go all the way up to the International Space Station like this one? Or do we go all the way down into the microns in a grain of dirt? So it really depends. We have to make some hard choices, and those choices need to be made at what level our maps are going to be made. Where are the boundaries of the maps? And those boundaries demarcate our sphere of concern. And we saw some maps also earlier about Atlanta, for example, the jungle, the urban jungle maps as well. So so that's the second cartographical challenge. So the first one, theological, the second one is sociological, political, the third one is epistemological, which is how do we orient ourselves in the cosmos and what we accept as pertinent information to shape our productive and consumptive practices. We are now in an era of egocentrism. This is the map of today. Just turn on your smartphone, go to Google Maps, Waze, whatever. You are the center of your cosmos. What matters now more is not what's around you, not the terrain, not terra firma, but your path, your journey. It's all narcissistic. We're now becoming so belly button fascinated. This is what matters, is right here. Me, my ego, my instant gratification. Where can I find this store and how can I get there fast? And for better and for worse, that's what the kind of civilization that we're working in. And perhaps what we need to do is create new, old, different maps that reorient ourselves in this world. And again, perhaps we need to take wisdom from the bees to populate our maps dramatically differently. Perhaps we need to take our maps and put other people on them, not the Tinders of the world, but the maps of concern, communities of concern, common concern, and reorient ourselves that way. I think that we also need to have other kinds of maps. Maps of the kitchen, for example. Amy and I, and Mindy, who was up here earlier, and Peggy, we co-teach a course where we're teaching students how to literally navigate a kitchen. Our college students have come on not knowing how to shop or cook or prep or plan a menu or anything like that. So learning how to navigate the culinary arts, I think, is a life skill that has been lost and that we as educators need to recultivate in our students. We also need to have maps of our bodies because many of us don't know basic nutrition. We don't know what our bodily needs are. And so we need to recultivate that notion of personal knowledge. And I think that such maps need to be written in two different formats. One is certainly in ink, in public policy, business policy, agricultural policy. That certainly needs to be, those maps need to be written. I think that another kind of map is the kind that is found in the soil underneath your own fingernails. And I think many of us here would welcome that opportunity, especially on a glorious day like today. So on behalf of myself, at least, thank you so much for organizing this amazing conference. It's so enriching, and I look forward to furthering our conversations.
I'm going to conclude our time this evening with a brief word of thanks. We're grateful to our keynote speaker, Jonathan Crane, and for all the panelists who have shared their insights with us this evening. I also want to recognize the 4 students from Georgia Tech who served as our volunteers today, Tika, Elizabeth, Kelly, and Allison. We wouldn't have been able to do this without you. And also Joanna Jaskova and Joe Zima from Ivan Allen College as well. This symposium would not have been possible without those and others from the Emory and Georgia Tech campuses. So thank you to everyone who contributed to this. We hope that you'll take a moment when you return home and complete the online survey that we're sending out to you to offer us feedback on this event and perhaps suggestions for future events. Also tune into our website. It's lamp.iac.gatech.edu, and we have a couple upcoming lectures. So an evening lecture on March 29th on faith and evolution, and a lunch and lecture on April 4th on the legacy of Gandhi, King, and Mandela. So we do have a few other upcoming events. Finally, as a token of our appreciation and a reminder of our conversations today, we invite you to take a small plant from the registration tables as you leave this evening. Thank you again for joining us for this second annual LAMP Symposium, and have a great night.